after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, the regulatory guidance that was published by places like CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, was far more resembling, I'll use my own word, coercion than negotiation. The government telling the pharma, you need to turn over an enormous amount of data points about your product, pricing information, research information, material costs, all these things about your product, and then the government, will tell you the fair price. It doesn't sound like negotiation to me.
All right, welcome to another episode of Life Sciences 360. My guest today is Jesse Mendelsohn. He is the Senior Vice President at Model N. Model N, is, from what I know, doing some research, it's a revenue optimization platform or technology for pharmaceutical companies. So we're going to be going a lot into pricing and stuff like that. So please welcome Jesse to the show, and let's talk to him and learn what he's doing at Model N. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thank you, Harsh. It's good to be here, and thank you all who listening.
Yeah, so I know you've been with the company a couple decades, so a long time. To start off, how has the company evolved from your day one to where it's today?
Yeah, it's interesting, and you're right. It will be 19 years next month, which is
Hmm.
shocking to me. I started right out of graduate school. Um, in the company's changed in a lot of very good ways. I would say that when I first joined, the solutions that we found were very operational, basically allowing manufacturers to properly administer their contracts and to accurately submit their pricing. And I think over time, both our company has realized and also the life science industry has realized that these applications and the results are more strategic than just operational. The way that you price your products and the way that you get your products to market and the way that you discount your products really is driving competitive advantage, not just boxes you have to check to stay in business. So I think the value of
Mm.
our products has really expanded the past 2 decades, as well as the life sciences industry understanding of how contracting and how accurate compliance and handling the government as a customer can really improve margins and get competitive advantage versus just we need to file these numbers properly.
Mm. Mm. So you mentioned about having customers in life sciences or pharma and having the understanding of government regulations and things around pricing. So when Model N gets a new customer or somebody who is interested in adopting the technology, like what are some of the things that the company is looking for? uh I know maybe the company knows, okay, we need a revenue management software. That's simple, but like deep down, what are maybe three or four other things that they're looking for? And how does Model N make those modules or features available to them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say there's two main sides of Model N in a pharmaceutical
Hmm.
company. Commercial and regulatory is what we call it. And
Okay.
most manufacturers realize that they have a need to more accurately be able to manage their commercial contracting or
Hmm.
to have the ability to create and administer more complicated commercial contracting for the purposes of getting their drug to market. And so
Hmm.
often what we'll see is the manufacturer will say, we have agreements with pharmacy benefit managers where we pay rebates based on prescription data. We have agreements with group purchasing organizations where they buy products at discounts. We subdivide those group purchasing organizations for the purposes of offering discounts to higher volume purchasers. And administering this has become a nightmare. We have this enormous contract marketing team and spreadsheets and or old systems or homegrown systems, and not only has it become a nightmare to administer all those pricings and products for all my portfolio and therapeutic classes, but I am limited in what I can do. I have contract marketing or
Hmm.
I have our sales teams coming to us saying, "Hey, we want to enter into like an innovative value-based agreement for this new oncology product that we have, where we have skin in the game, and we will pay a higher rebate if the patient doesn't enter remission." And I can't enter those contracts. I don't have the technical wherewithal to do it. So
Right.
that's typically what we see on the commercial side. We see these people struggling with that, and that's why they call Model N a revenue management company. The other
Hmm.
side is regulatory. Now, with I could, regulatory is the area I quote unquote grew up in. It's where I'm most comfortable. And it's important for people to realize that even though the United States doesn't have Canadian or Israeli or British style single payer healthcare, the government is by and large most manufacturers' largest customer. Because if you think about it, even when we don't have single payer universal health care, if you add up Medicare, people 65 or older, if you add up Medicaid, which depending on the state covers a lot of people at or near the poverty level, TRICARE, so covering all active duty military members and their spouses and their children, the Veterans
Hmm.
Administration, due to certain geopolitical events, we have a large veterans community in this country. So if you add that all up, the government is still a massive insurer and purchaser of drugs. So
Right.
the regulatory side is as important in some areas as more important than the commercial side, meaning that
Hmm.
there's highly regulated ways that uh, these government entities get their drugs priced, drugs get delivered, drugs get distributed, that these government programs get rebated down to net prices that are mandated by the various programs. And on that side, manufacturers typically say, we're concerned either from an audit and compliance perspective, like we want to make sure that we are in good faith following all these rules and regulations
Hmm.
accurately and submitting accurate numbers to the sixth decimal on a regular way that we can audit and we can run our business without fear of some type of either mistake or even if not a mistake, an inability or an expensive response to an auditing question from a government entity or somebody on their behalf. So those are kind of the two
Hmm.
sides that we see. And then the third, to your point, is the third thing I would say is just optimizing across the whole process. Is better analytics as to what's happening in both those areas, how those areas interact with each other, and what manufacturers could do from a pricing and compliance perspective to get better margin.
Mm, mm. So your platform helps them with determining the price. Is that correct? Like, is there like some statistic or algorithm or something involved that helps them, maybe look at a certain set of criteria, the therapeutic, area that their product is, and come to a dollar value of, hey, this is a range, or this is where you should price your product compared to the market? Or how does the company come to the price? Like, let's say if I'm taking a cancer drug from, uh I don't know, Novartis, BMS, whatever, and the cost of that drug is $1,500 or whatever, my insurance covers some, and maybe I pay 200 or 300, insurance pays the remaining. I'm just throwing numbers out. So I'm trying to understand, like, how does your platform help a company come to the conclusion that, hey, your drug should be priced at the 1,000 or 2,000 or the $10,000 range?
So I would say a couple things. So I would say for international pricing, our platform does it very strong. We have a very large um, product called global price management, and part of that is global
Hmm.
launch excellence, where essentially if you were to launch a product, it is very complicated outside the US where which
Right.
market you launch in first, because there's certain rules among, if I launch first in France and I launch at this price, then other countries such as, I'm making this up but this is how it works, like Belgium and Sweden refer to that price, which could decrease France's price and the Swedish price. So there's a lot of um, machine learning and AI into strategy about exactly, you're right, what price to launch at and
Right.
how that price should then be introduced to which market and which area to reduce price erosion over time while still making sure that patients in those countries have access to that therapy. Now,
Hmm.
within the United States, it's much more complicated. And what our software focuses on is less so determining that initial price, but more so administering that price flawlessly. So once you determine the price for your product, and remember, it's not just a price, it is the list price for your product, but also what discounts you're providing both to wholesalers and also to group purchasing organizations, to hospital systems, sometimes
Correct.
individual physician practices, and also what after the fact rebates are you paying to health plans and pharmacy benefit managers
Hmm.
to get and maintain formulary status, to your point, so that you have a cost sharing arrangement, you have access to that drug even if you have a copay? What as the manufacturer agreeing to do that, and and in what amounts? And what our system does is it executes that flawlessly. So you have
Hmm.
potentially 90 different price points for a drug depending on whether a provider belongs to a group purchasing organization, has its own agreement, is a member of an IDN, like a health system that also has its own contract, and also at the back end, the various health plans can have tremendously different rebates depending on the formulary status they buy to a drug, they assign to a drug, the volume at which they're reimbursing pharmacies for prescriptions for that drug, and so on. So what our system does is it administers those agreements flawlessly, and then
Hmm.
all of those that data gets poured into government submissions, and we execute
I
those and
see.
calculate those also flawlessly.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. All right. So it's more, you're also handling all the documentation, the contracts, the notifying, different agencies and whatnot,
Exactly.
not just like a statistical tool to come to the price, but what do you do after you determine that price? Like how do you connect to different, you know, organizations, whether it's a hospital, pharmacy, or government or whatever. Yeah, it's interesting. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah, I worked in pharma for 15 years, and till to this date I have I would say I have very limited knowledge, probably at the lowest level of pricing, or how companies come to it. And this has been like a discussion with friends and families, and they're like, oh yeah, you work for this company, so why is this drug so expensive? I was like, I don't know. I don't
Well,
work in the
it's
in the pricing. Yeah.
even exactly, Harsh. I'll tell you, like even the well, is the drug really expensive? You can go up a
Yeah.
level and get more
Yeah.
philosophical. Like, well, is this drug even expensive? What value does the drug provide? I remember several years ago, I think the early 2010s, I might get the date wrong. Gilead essentially cured hepatitis C. But the therapy was $80,000, and people, on one side of the perspective, were saying, "Oh well, $80,000. This is insane. This is a highway robbery." But the other side, we're saying, well, you cure hepatitis C, you extend these people's lifespans by potentially decades. You limit the need for liver transplants, which are far more than $80,000. And so this is from a value perspective, this drug isn't expensive at all. So I echo what you're saying. It's a common discussion among my family and friends as well. But you can get really deeply philosophical with these discussions as well, and less so just practical about why the drug was priced what it's priced.
Right, right. Yeah, that reminds me of another. I think it was Novartis drug that was like 1 million or something. I is some crazy amount, and I didn't know it was that expensive until somebody told me, like a friend or family is like, "Hey, you do you know like there's drugs that are like $1 million?" And I'm like, "No, that's
Yeah,
not true. Like you got to show me the link." And he sent me a link to like a blog that had, I think it was some cell therapy or some drug from Novartis. I can't
exactly.
remember the
No, it's
name.
yeah, so it's a
Yeah.
drug. It's from Novartis. Now, Novartis is not the only company that has $1 million drugs, but yes, they have one, and it treats a genetic disorder that's found in children.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
think about it. So think about the potentially hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that Novartis and its
Mm.
affiliates had to put into discovering that drug. And think of the patient population. Now, these patient populations are very small. This is not a large, enormous genetic disorder that millions of kids have. It's very small. So this is an incredible triumph of medicine that now these
Yep.
kids who used to have no way of or hopelessness now have a way to have some normalcy in their lives. But for Novartis to even hope to make back that investment and therefore invest more in treating more of these orphan or rare diseases, that's what they need to charge. So it's the same conversation from a value perspective. $1 million to have a kid live a somewhat normal life versus previously be horribly a debilitated life. That $1 million doesn't seem so bad, particularly because it's such a rare disease. It's not $1 million per kid. So you see what I mean? This is often where these discussions go when you're having this conversation about drug development and drug pricing.
Right. I mean, ultimately it comes down to, I don't think you can put a dollar amount on a life-saving drug. I mean, it's all perspective, right? Like we're not buying a car or like a house where you can be like, "Oh, you don't need this." Like you want it, right? But when it comes to life, or when it comes to, like you gave an example, uh every person has a different perspective. If if I don't know anyone who could use that drug, or it doesn't happen, to a family member, I may have a different outlook. But for somebody who is going through that, to them, it might be like, yeah, this is not that bad because I'm still gonna be able to, save or cure the life of the person that I love or care. So yeah, it is a very slippery topic. Yeah.
Exactly, and I agree. The conversation of how do we make sure that all kids, regardless of their parents' insurance situation or how much money they have, who
Mm,
have this genetic disorder have access to drug, that's absolutely a good conversation to have. And from my experience, companies like in this case Novartis are actively involved in those conversations. And because remember, I always tell people, when I'm approached with the discussion of, is pharma price gouging, or I can't get my pharma doesn't want people to not be able to access its drugs from a
right.
both a success perspective, but also just making money perspective. Pharma wants people to access their drugs. That's
Hmm.
exactly how they make money. That's how they get market share, and that's frankly how they live their mission. That's why these companies exist. So I agree that the conversation of, well, how is it, so are there kids in this country who have that genetic disease but have no capability, and their physicians agree that this drug will be beneficial to them, but they have no capability of getting it? That's a conversation I think is more important to have versus, well, is this price too high? Because that gets more philosophical based on what I said.
Yeah, yeah. I want to switch gears and go to a topic that you had when we were discussing about this episode and discussing some topics. You had mentioned about the Inflation Reduction Act. Uh, so, if can you give a listeners maybe a two or three line of how that came out to be and what it is, and maybe then we can go into some other questions that I have for you on that topic.
Sure. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed by the Biden administration a couple summers ago. And what most people likely have heard about the Inflation Reduction Act is, very, very broad, sweeping changes to a lot of things in American life, with the purpose of, yes, reducing inflation, but also, spurring certain industries. But of the, I might get these numbers wrong, but I'm roughly right. Of the 700 rough pages of the Inflation Reduction Act, about 200 were specifically about drug pricing. So it was predominantly a bill focused on drug pricing. Now, what people might be most familiar with, based on what's covered in the news, is the Medicare for certain drugs now has the right to negotiate its price based on its size. And that is the biggest thing that's probably made the news, is that, for Part B, which is, physician administered drugs, and for Part D, which is drugs gotten in the pharmacy setting, Medicare is increasing the number of drugs to which it's applying what's called a maximum fair price, or an MFP, based on negotiation. And that is the biggest thing that's come from this. And for a very, very long time, as a concept, I remember going all the way back to the Deficit Reduction Act back in 2005, or even prior to that, during the George W. Bush administration. There was discussion around Medicare should be allowed to negotiate based on its size. This is not a new concept, but the IRA is the first law that, with some teeth, actually put this into practice, or was
Hmm.
supposed to. That's a. But I'll leave it at there for a background.
Okay, so when you say Medicare is allowed to negotiate, before the Inflation Reduction Act, there were, let's say, X number of drugs for which the Medicare could negotiate, and now that number, or that now the number of drugs is expanded to a bigger list, or what do you mean by there's more drugs that it can negotiate?
Yes. So prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, there were certain Medicare products that
Hmm.
Medicare basically reimbursed based on the average sale for that product. So, for example,
Okay.
for physician administered products like injectables, Medicare Part B largely would reimburse physicians for the average price that was reported by manufacturers that that product was sold for, the average sales price, and
Yep.
plus a small percentage to, reimburse a physician for his or her services. So
Hmm.
there wasn't for Part B a mechanism to negotiate Medicare discounts, but basically the price that Medicare paid was similar to the commercial price. Medicare had
Oh, I
some
see.
abilities, exactly. So Medicare had some abilities
Hmm.
to reduce that price. For example, Medicare would group products together into similar therapeutic categories and only reimburse the physician at the rate of the weighted average of all those products in that category. So, for example, if I'm just making this up, if you have three drugs that treat arthritis and they're all in the same therapeutic category, and and the physician dispenses a very expensive one from that category, they may only get reimbursed at the cost of the cheaper one in that category. So there were mechanisms to encourage physicians to use cheaper products, but that's different than negotiating actual prices, if you know what I mean. And on the Part D side, there was more traditional negotiation the way that it works right now with commercial PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, where there were formularies and statuses, but still it wasn't, you know, the government sitting down and negotiating. With the IRA, to your point, Harsh, there are now lists coming out where these are lists of products that are now coming out where Medicare is saying, no, pharmaceutical company, if your product is on this list, you need to quote unquote sit down with us and negotiate directly what is now called the maximum fair price, the MFP for these products.
Wow. Okay, that explains a lot. It's interesting. So then this, you mentioned that it's 200 pages of information around drug pricing in this Inflation Reduction Act. Uh, I know it's possibly, or I should say, it's impossible to ask you what that means for the pharmaceutical industry or people in the executive positions at pharma companies. But what are like one or three takeaways from that 200 pages that you want, or you think the executives at pharma companies should care about?
Sure. Well, the first one I will say is you need to get a good lawyer and good legal advice, and
Hmm.
also a good revenue management system that will keep up to date with these changes. That's a very,
Yep.
very important because there's new rebates and new pricing, and we are rapidly updating our software. So I think it's very key to do that. That's the first of the three I'll give you. And
Yep.
a good lawyer and good auditors and good advisors are just as important as a good system to administer it. I'll say
Hmm.
two other things that I think are having aftershocks. I didn't come up with the term aftershock. I heard it at a conference, but I like the term. There's aftershocks
Yeah.
of the IRA. One is this negotiation is turning out to not really be negotiation, and there's some litigation about this. Basically, when you hear negotiation, you think of the way you negotiate to buy a car, to buy a house.
Yep.
You look at fair price, you look at surveys, you meet with the seller, you say, look, I think basically on the volume you're going to buy or what I'm getting in return, I think this is a fair price. They say, no, I think it should be higher. You say, I think it should be lower. And you come across and you hammer out a contract and that becomes the price. That's actually not what's happening right now. After the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, the regulatory guidance that was published by places like CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, was far more resembling, I'll use my own word, coercion than negotiation. Basically, what happened is the guidance was, the government telling the pharma, you need to turn over an enormous amount of data points about your product, enormous amount of pricing information, research information, material costs, all these things about your product, and then the government, will tell you the fair price. It doesn't sound like negotiation to me. And that's caused a lot of stirs and a lot of concern in the pharmaceutical industry because I didn't see a lot of fear or apprehension in the pharmaceutical industry about negotiation when they thought or assumed that it would be genuinely what we all think of as negotiation. Rather, what we see now is they feel like they're being coerced. And there's a lot of downstream impacts of that, and even some legality questions about that you're seeing right now being fought in the courts.
Hmm.
The third thing I would say, you asked me for three. The first was get a good system and a good lawyer. The second is really understand what negotiation means in this case. The third is inflation penalties have now been introduced to Medicare. Now, what inflation penalties are is basically if you, as a drug company, have increased your drug price faster than the rate of inflation, you now owe the delta, the difference between the allowable price increase due to the rate of inflation and what you increase your price, back to the government in the form of a rebate. Now,
Hmm.
this has existed for quite some time in Medicaid So
Okay.
in Medicaid, which is a different government health insurance program, there has been inflation penalties where basically if you same thing you owe the government rebate. That's there for quite some time, and also for the Veterans Administration and the federal supply schedule that it administers, there's also an annual cap on how fast you can increase your drugs price based on the rate of inflation. So this is frankly not new to the industry. It's already existed in other government healthcare programs, and the fact that it's now being applied to Medicare is not that surprising. But it's
Yep.
still important for people and manufacturers and executives to realize that by increasing your drug price to even maintain margin, you may now be bumping up against this maximum fair price if you're on one of these lists. And even if you're not bumping up against this maximum fair price, you might be incurring rebate liability to Medicare, which is a very large market. So
Mm.
basically, get a good lawyer, good revenue management system, understand what MFP means in negotiation versus coercion, and understand these inflation rebates that you're about to incur depending on how and how quickly you increase your drugs prices.
Yeah, that's thanks for that summary. So this Inflation Reduction Act, from what it sounds like, it's applicable to pharmaceuticals, biotech, medical devices. Like what types of companies in the life science ecosystem will in your words have the aftershock, so to speak?
Pharmaceutical and biotech companies.
But
Now, I don't want to
pharmaceutical.
say med tech is not impacted. There likely are ways that I'm not thinking about, and some of my med tech colleagues, when they watch
Okay.
this podcast, might say, "Jesse, why didn't you bring that up?" But I don't know med tech that well.
Yeah.
But I will say largely pharmaceutical, biotech.
Okay.
Also, not and I mean all pharmaceuticals. Generic pharmaceuticals are impacted.
Mm.
Biosimilar manufacturers, biologics, they're all impacted. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So then I want to double click on the second point that you made, that it's more of, it appeared to be as a negotiation, but as more and more information is coming out, it's more of a, like you said, show us the data point, show us how you came to this. So as a leadership of a pharma or biotech company that's doing strategic planning of your drug development, clinical trials, commercial, whatever, how can, like, what does this do to the drug development strategy? Now, is pharma going to start collecting more data points to support, like, hey, you asked us for data, here you go, this is, how do you think it's going to change sort of the data collection across the drug development?
That's a good question, Harsh. I would say let me give you two answers to that. The first is the more immediate, the more tactical, and it's exactly as you say. I mean, we're updating our software to collect and maintain more data for the purposes of these negotiate or new negotiations. So, from a more immediate perspective, you're right. There is going to be more data collection, more analysis within pharmaceutical companies to make sure that they can comply and respond to these government requests as part of the MFP, the maximum fair price negotiation. Absolutely. I'd say more broadly speaking is where the bigger issue is here. There's a couple things. Even if your drug is not on one of these lists yet. Let's say you're a pharmaceutical or a biotech company, and your drug is currently not on the list that Medicare is saying you must negotiate with me on a maximum fair price. What happens if you have a drug that competes with the drug that's on that list? You know, you're still impacted because if your drug competes with the drug that's on the list and that drug is subject to a price cap, that will likely increase or decrease or change at least your ability to access the Medicare market. Or what if you have a drug in clinical trials right now that is very promising that would also treat the same condition as a drug that's on one of those lists? Your financial outlook for that drug that was the calculus for why you started developing that drug and put it in clinical trials changes. Another thing I'll say is the traditional way that most Americans are understanding drug prices come down is the drug is on the market, it's expensive for X number of years because it's branded, and then suddenly with great fanfare it goes generic. And eventually the price at the pharmacy goes down from your copay or very expensive out of pocket if you haven't hit your deductible down to $10 for 90 days. And that's the typical way in the American system of how drug prices go down. But let's say that I'm a generic manufacturer or a biosimilar manufacturer, and I typically like to target expensive drugs that are coming off patent to create a generic or biosimilar equivalent of that drug so that I could compete with that drug, get some of the revenue while the price is high, and continue to get revenue as the price decreases. Now, would I still have the same motivation to compete with a drug that is on one of those lists because it's already capped at this MFP? So this existence of this price could actually limit generic and biosimilar competition for these drugs on these lists, and that is odd in this strange way, a way that could keep the prices high, even though the purpose of this act and the IRA in general was to lower drug prices.
Hmm. Yeah, there's I have to say I love how you explain these very complex topics with simple to understand examples. I really appreciate that because, as I told you, this is a topic where I don't know much about, but yeah, I think you've had tons of experience working in this domain, which is obvious in the way you explain things. But yeah, I love that. Uh, so if you so we've talked a lot about what's the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act for pharmaceutical companies, or also the negotiation and stuff, but what's maybe a positive outcome in the long run that you feel is going to come out of this?
I mean, so, you know, many of us have parents and grandparents who are in Medicare, and this will make their lives better. My father is struggling with cancer, and God bless him, he's in remission right now. But the drugs that he was put on to deal with his cancer were very expensive, and starting soon there will be a cap of how much he has to spend out of pocket, and that's part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And that is a very big help to our parents and friends and grandparents who are on Medicare. You cannot deny that for those who are on Medicare today, their lives will be easier. They'll have better access to medication. And by and large, they will spend less money on that medication. So you can't deny that. Now, again, there's aftershocks because of that. Prices may increase on the commercial market because of these caps and changes and limits on Medicare. But many of us love our parents and grandparents, and this will make their lives easier for people on Medicare. And you can't deny that this will be a benefit for them, and that's important to pretty much anybody in America.
Great, great. And what's next for Model N? Do you I know, maybe you can share some, are there any interesting features or modules or something that you're building? Obviously, you're staying in touch with all the regulatory and all the changes happening in the environment and trying to make sure the platform can handle anything from the documentation or the data side. But what else are there any interesting features or something that you're working on?
Yeah, it's interesting. So again, I don't want to get in trouble with my marketing folks, so I'm not going
Yeah,
to
yeah.
say the name of that it will be GA or what it is, but I'll
Yes.
talk about kind of an area that we're moving in. Is upstream data. Let me just put it that way.
Mm,
A lot of manufacturers rely on things like clean customer data to make decisions and to accurately pay rebates and administer pricing. Because remember,
yep.
customer data is very complicated. Think of the number of entities in this country. Think of where you're sitting right now, and with a 5 mile radius, how many entities can legally purchase prescription drugs? Are there doctors' offices? Are there pharmacies? Or is there a hospital or clinics? Think about that. Now, all those doctors' offices and hospitals and pharmacies and clinics have different contractual relationships with wholesalers and with drug manufacturers. They might be members of group purchasing organizations.
Mm,
They might be specific classes of trade or 340B entities that or long-term care facilities, which allow them to have specific pricing. And it's very, very complicated. And making sure that the right entity, when they order a drug, gets the right price for that drug based on who they are, what pricing is available to them, what contracts they're eligible for, what group they belong to, is critical and a key component of revenue management. And so I'd say one area we're moving into, without being too specific, is a very clean cross industry view of the customers in this country who can legally buy prescription drugs, as well as what GPOs they are members of and what contract they might be eligible for. A much, much cleaner way of understanding and making sure pricing is accurate versus each individual pharmaceutical company trying to do that on their own, largely duplicating work across the industry. So that's one area I'd say we're investing quite heavily in. The
great.
other way I'd say is we're we're investing a lot more in the payer side of the industry. Payer is dealing with pharmaceutical benefit managers and specialty pharmacies, basically, paying discounts after the fact to PBMs based on utilization prescription data that they send you. Now,
Right.
PBMs will send you millions or billions of rows of prescription data, and the more you are able to analyze that data and determine if it really is eligible for a rebate, the more money you save and the more compliant that you are. So we're also investing heavily in tools that allow manufacturers to scrub out, called data scrubbing, to scrub out prescription lines that might have been dispensed from 340B inventory. Basically, they were dispensed from a discounted inventory eligible to certain contract pharmacies, and therefore they should not be also eligible for a rebate from the manufacturer. Or if a manufacturer agreed to pay rebates on certain products, assuming those products had a certain opportune formulary status in that plan. Basically, the plan made it easy for their patients to get that drug because it had a low copay, or was not, didn't require pre-authorization. Then the manufacturer agreed to pay a rebate for that drug. Now, when on the day that drug was dispensed, was the formulary for that PBM actually published in a way that that drug was in that opportune position for which it earned a rebate? If you the, paying that accurately is incredibly important, and that's the area I'd say we're investing in very heavily in as well. Both on the formulary management side, on the scrubbing out of 340B data on the side, and making sure that accurate rebates are paid accurately. I'll say that we measure success a lot at Model N, not only in do our customers like our software and like me, and like coming to our conferences, and will they recommend us to others, but also how much money are they saving? How much rebate liability has decreased. Prior to implementation, they used to pay X dollars in PBM rebates. After implementing one of these products like Validata or 340B Vigilance, they have now decreased that, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars of savings just in the first year. And it's because of these types of things that we're investing in.
Yeah, it's again, it's a very interesting area. Like I said at the start of this discussion, and I don't get to work much in this area. Like my most of the projects that I work with clients are in manufacturing, lab systems, clinical trial systems. So anything that's sort of GMP, GLP, GCP regulated stuff. I don't get to work on these types of software, so that's why I don't know much about all the different software companies, but from everything I've talked to you, it sounds like Model N is one of the top comprehensive solutions in this area, and you're constantly evolving with new
Yes.
changes in the market landscape. So that's awesome.
I appreciate it, Harsh. It's interesting to say. The only thing that's constant here is change. I remember
Yes.
when the Inflation Reduction Act was signed, the CEO of my company asked me, "So Jesse, like all these new government rules, what did these replace?" And I said, his name's Jason. I said nothing, Jason. Like, companies still need to comply to all the previous rules, and now this on top of it. So
Yep.
so
Yep.
it's just more complexity, more change, and you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Thanks again for your time. It was a pleasure talking with you. Any final words? Where can listeners connect with you or learn more about Model N after this episode?
Absolutely. So I encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I share some thought pieces. I also share some thought pieces from other people who I respect greatly who are in the drug pricing industry.
Yep.
And it should be easy to find me. I work for SVP at Model N. Search Jesse Mendelsohn. Feel free to connect me or follow me. I would also say just check out the Model N website. We're
Yep.
constantly refreshing it with white papers and webinars and blog posts and these types of things, very broadly industry applicable. Even if you don't use our software or any of our services, we try to put a lot of good thought pieces on there to, help keep people up to date.
Yeah, yeah, that I'll definitely check it out. Like I said, I don't know much about this area, but I like consuming content online. Especially, like you said, if it's written agnostic of the software or the system, then yeah, I like to learn. So thank you, Jesse. It was a pleasure having you on, and wish you and Model N tons of success.
Thank you, Arch. Appreciate it. Have a very good day.
Thanks.